It was just another Tuesday morning. The kind where you wake up, already knowing exactly how the day will go. Same alarm, same coffee shop, same everything. He'd been living like this for months now, moving through life on autopilot. The coffee shop was packed that morning. People rushed in and out grabbing their drinks before heading to work. The smell of fresh coffee mixed with the sound of milk being steamed and conversations happening all around. He stood in line checking his phone like everyone else, not really paying attention to anything. He was 28 years old and worked as a graphic designer. Not a bad life, really. He had a decent apartment, a stable job, and enough money to pay his bills. But if someone asked him if he was happy, he wouldn't know how to answer. He wasn't unhappy either. He just existed. 6 months ago, his girlfriend had left. They'd been together for 3 years. And then one day she sat him down and said she felt like she was living with a ghost. Those words had hurt, but what hurt more was that he couldn't really argue with her. He had become distant, closed off, going through the motions of a relationship without really being present. After she left, he told himself he was fine. He convinced himself that being alone was easier. No complications, no expectations, no risk of hurting anyone or being hurt. He built walls around himself and called it peace. The line moved forward. He ordered his usual medium coffee, black, nothing fancy. He'd been coming to this place for 2 years now. Always sat at the same table by the window. Always worked on his laptop for an hour before heading to the office. Routine was comfortable. Routine was safe. But that morning there was someone new behind the counter. A woman he hadn't seen before. She had her hair tied back and was moving quickly, trying to keep up with the morning rush. There was something about her energy that was different from the other staff. She smiled at every customer like she actually meant it. When it was his turn, she looked at him and said, "Medium coffee, black?" He was surprised. "Yeah, how did you—" "I noticed you ordered that yesterday," she said with a small laugh. "I started working here last week. I'm trying to remember everyone's orders." He nodded, impressed but also a little uncomfortable with being noticed. He'd gotten used to being invisible. She prepared his coffee quickly, and then came the moment that would change everything. She handed him the cup and their fingers touched. Just for a second, maybe even less than that, it wasn't romantic. It wasn't electric. It was something else entirely. Something he couldn't explain. It felt like recognition. Like his body suddenly remembered it was alive. Like someone had flipped a switch inside him that had been off for months. He mumbled a quick thank you and walked to his usual table, but his hands were shaking slightly. He sat down, opened his laptop, and stared at the screen without seeing anything. His heart was beating faster than normal. His mind was racing. What was that? Why did such a small thing affect him like this? He tried to focus on his work. He had a logo design due by the end of the week, and the client was picky. But every few minutes his mind wandered back to that moment. The brief touch. The feeling of another person's skin against his. He realized something disturbing. He couldn't remember the last time someone had touched him. Really touched him. Sure, he shook hands with clients. He high-fived his coworkers sometimes. But actual human contact? The kind that makes you feel connected to another person? It had been months. He glanced back at the counter. The new barista was laughing with an elderly customer, taking extra time to make sure the man's order was perfect. She had paint stains on her fingers, he noticed. An artist, maybe. She moved with a kind of purpose that made everyone around her seem half asleep by comparison. The rest of his time in the coffee shop felt strange. He kept catching himself looking up from his laptop, watching the flow of people, seeing the world around him in a way he hadn't in a long time. It was like he'd been living in black and white, and suddenly there was color again. When he finally packed up his things and left, he felt disoriented. The walk to his office felt different. The sunlight seemed brighter. He noticed a dog playing in a park across the street. He heard a street musician playing guitar on the corner. Had all of this always been here? Of course it had. He just hadn't been paying attention. At work, his colleague asked him if he was okay. "You seem distracted," she said. "I'm fine," he replied automatically. But he wasn't fine. He was confused, unsettled. A simple touch had cracked something open inside him, and now he couldn't close it again. During his lunch break, he sat alone in the break room and tried to make sense of what he was feeling. It wasn't attraction exactly. He didn't know this woman at all. She was a stranger who happened to hand him a coffee cup. But something about that moment had reminded him of what it felt like to be human, to be part of the world instead of just observing it from behind glass. He thought about his ex-girlfriend's words. Living with a ghost. She'd been right. He had become a ghost, moving through spaces without really occupying them, existing without really living. The afternoon dragged on. He finished the logo design, sent it to the client, and answered some emails. But his mind kept drifting back to the coffee shop, to the touch, to the feeling of connection he'd experienced for just a fraction of a second. That evening he went home to his empty apartment. He made dinner, pasta with store-bought sauce, and ate it while watching a show he'd seen 3 times before. This was his routine. This was his life. But tonight it felt suffocating. He lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. His mind wouldn't shut off. He kept replaying the moment over and over. The touch, the eye contact, the smile. Such small things. Things that happen to millions of people every day. So why did it feel like his world had shifted? Around 2 a.m, he finally understood. It wasn't about the woman at all. It was about him. That touch had shown him how disconnected he'd become, how numb, how carefully he'd built a life that required nothing from him emotionally. No risks, no vulnerability, no real connection. And for the first time in 6 months, he felt something crack inside those walls he'd built, not breaking down completely, just a small crack. But it was enough to let some light in, enough to make him wonder if maybe, just maybe, he was tired of living like a ghost. He didn't know it yet, but that moment in the coffee shop was just the beginning. That simple touch had started something he couldn't stop, and nothing would feel the same again. The next morning he woke up with a strange feeling in his chest. Anxiety maybe, or anticipation. He wasn't sure which. Part of him wanted to go back to the coffee shop, and part of him wanted to avoid it entirely. He went anyway. Of course he did. It was his routine, and he was a creature of habit. But this time he paid attention to his heartbeat as he walked through the door. It was faster than usual. His palms were slightly sweaty. Ridiculous. He was acting like a teenager. She was there again, working the morning shift. When she saw him, she smiled.
Medium coffee, black, right?
Yeah, he said, trying to sound casual. Good memory. It's my superpower, she joked, turning to prepare his drink. This time, when she handed him the cup, their fingers didn't touch. She was careful about it, he noticed. Professional. And he felt oddly disappointed, which made him feel even more ridiculous. Thanks, he said, and quickly moved to his table. But he couldn't concentrate on work. He kept glancing at the counter, watching her interact with customers. She had this way of making everyone feel seen. An older woman came in looking stressed and overwhelmed, and the barista took an extra minute to ask if she was okay. A college student seemed confused about what to order, and she patiently explained the different options without making him feel stupid. He realized he was learning things about her just by watching. She was kind, patient, present in a way most people weren't. She treated every interaction like it mattered, even if it was just handing someone a cup of coffee. Over the next week, something shifted in his routine. Going to the coffee shop became less automatic and more intentional. He started arriving a few minutes earlier. He began to notice small details. The way she sketched on napkins during slow moments, always drawing flowers or abstract patterns. The way she hummed along to whatever music was playing. The way she remembered not just orders, but faces, names, little details people had mentioned days before. One rainy morning, she looked up as he walked in and said, "Medium coffee, black." "Coming right up." Then she paused. "Actually want to try something different today? This weather calls for something warmer, maybe with cinnamon?" He should have said no. He always ordered the same thing. But instead he heard himself say, "Sure, why not?" The drink she made was perfect. He told her so, and she grinned like he'd just given her the best compliment in the world. "I knew you'd like it. You seem like someone who appreciates the details." That comment stuck with him all day. She'd noticed something about him. She'd seen him, really seen him in a way he wasn't used to being seen. They started having small conversations after that. Nothing deep. Just brief exchanges while she made his drink or when the shop was less crowded. She asked about the design work he was always doing on his laptop. He asked about her sketches. She told him she was an artist trying to make it work while paying rent. He told her he used to paint before life got too busy. "You should start again," she said simply. "Life's always going to be busy. That's just an excuse. Her directness surprised him. But she wasn't wrong. Then one morning, everything changed again. He walked in and she immediately knew his order without asking. But this time she also said, "How's the project going? The one with the blue and green color scheme? You seemed really focused on it last week." He froze. She'd been paying attention. Really paying attention. Not just to his order, but to his work. To what he was doing, to him as a person. They talked for almost 5 minutes. About design, about art. About how hard it was to stay creative when life kept demanding practical things. And in those 5 minutes he felt more alive than he had in months. More present. More like himself. When he finally sat down at his table, his hands were shaking. This was becoming something. He could feel it. Not romance necessarily, but connection. Real human connection. And it terrified him. Because connection meant vulnerability. It meant letting someone in. It meant risking the possibility of being hurt again, of hurting someone else, of failing to be present the way he'd failed before. So he did what scared people do. He ran. The next day he didn't go to the coffee shop. He told himself he was too busy, that he had an early meeting, that it didn't matter. He went to a drive-through chain instead and got a tasteless coffee that he barely finished. The day after that, he avoided it again. And the day after that, he found excuses. His routine, which had been so important to him for 2 years, suddenly became easy to break. Because breaking it was easier than facing what he was feeling. His best friend called him that weekend. They'd known each other since college, and he could always tell when something was wrong. "You're being weird," his friend said. "What's going on?" "Nothing. I'm fine." "You're never fine when you say you're fine." So he told him the whole story. The touch, the conversations, the running away. When he finished, there was a long silence on the other end of the phone. "Let me get this straight," his friend finally said. "A nice person was nice to you and you're avoiding her?" "It's more complicated than that." "Is it though? Sounds like you met someone who reminded you that humans are supposed to connect with each other, and instead of dealing with that, you're hiding." The truth hurt, but his friend wasn't done. "You've been sleepwalking since the breakup. We've all noticed it. You show up to things physically, but you're not really there, and now someone actually sees you, and you're running away. Why?" He didn't have a good answer. Fear maybe, or maybe he'd gotten so comfortable being numb that feeling anything felt dangerous. That night he lay in bed thinking about the coffee shop, about her smile, about the way she noticed things, about how those brief conversations had made him feel like himself again. But more than that, he thought about who he'd become. Someone who chose safety over connection, someone who protected himself so carefully that he'd stopped really living. His ex-girlfriend had been right. He was a ghost. And the worst part? He'd chosen to become one. 3 weeks had passed since he'd last been to the coffee shop. 3 weeks of bad drive-through coffee and feeling like a coward. He knew he couldn't keep avoiding it forever. The question was whether he had the courage to go back and face what he'd been running from. Not the barista. Not the possibility of connection with her specifically. But the bigger, scarier thing, the possibility of being alive again. Really alive. Open to whatever that might bring. Joy, pain, disappointment, hope, all of it. As he finally fell asleep that night, he made a decision. Tomorrow he'd go back. He stood outside the coffee shop for a full 5 minutes before going in. His heart was pounding like he was about to do something dangerous, in a way he supposed he was. Vulnerability is its own kind of danger. When he finally walked through the door, he looked immediately at the counter. She wasn't there. A different barista was working, a young guy he'd seen before but never really noticed. He felt a strange mix of relief and disappointment. "What can I get you?" the guy asked. "Medium coffee, black." Is the other barista working today?" The guy gave him a knowing look. "She's off today. Personal stuff." He nodded, ordered his coffee, and sat at his usual table. But nothing felt the same anymore. The table seemed wrong. The whole coffee shop seemed different without her energy in it. Over the next few days, he came back regularly, rebuilding his routine. She was there sometimes and not there other times. When she was there, they had brief conversations. When she wasn't, he found himself oddly disappointed. But something had shifted in him during those 3 weeks away. He'd done some thinking. A lot of thinking. About why that moment had affected him so deeply. About what it meant. About what he wanted his life to look like. One afternoon, when she was making his drink, he noticed she seemed tired. Her usual brightness was dimmed somehow. "Long day?" he asked. She smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Long month, more like. But I'm okay." He wanted to ask more, but the coffee shop was busy and there were people waiting behind him. So he just said, "I hope things get easier," and moved aside. Later that week, he was chatting with the other barista, the young guy, when he mentioned that she seemed down lately. "Yeah," the guy said, his voice getting quiet. "Her mom passed away a few weeks ago. She's been working through it. Says staying busy helps." The information hit him hard. Here he'd been, building up some imaginary connection in his head, projecting meaning onto a stranger when she'd been dealing with actual loss, real grief. Her kindness to customers wasn't about him at all. It was probably her way of coping, of finding moments of normalcy in the middle of pain. He felt foolish and small, and like he'd been incredibly self-centered, but it also clarified something for him. He hadn't been thinking about her clearly at all. He'd been thinking about himself, about what that touch meant to him, about his own numbness, about his own fears. She was a real person with a real life, and he knew almost nothing about her. That realization should have made things simpler. It should have made him let it go. But instead, it made him want to do something he'd been thinking about for days. He wanted to write her a note, not a love letter. Nothing romantic or presumptuous. Just something honest, something that acknowledged what had happened to him without placing any burden on her. He spent 2 days working on it, writing and rewriting, trying to find words that expressed what he meant without being weird or crossing boundaries. The final version was simple. "I don't know if you remember, but a few weeks ago when you handed me my coffee, our hands touched for just a second. It seems like such a small thing to mention, but I wanted you to know that moment changed something for me. I'd been moving through life disconnected from everything and everyone. That brief touch reminded me I was still capable of feeling connected to the world. I know this might sound strange, and I'm not expecting anything. I just wanted to say thank you for unknowingly helping me wake up. I hope whatever you're going through gets easier. You've made a lot of people's mornings brighter, including mine. I thought you should know that matters." He didn't sign it with his name, didn't include his number. This wasn't about starting something. It was about closure, about acknowledging what had happened and then letting it go. The next morning, he went to the coffee shop. She wasn't working. He gave the note to the other barista in a sealed envelope with just her name on it. "Can you give this to her?" he asked. "Sure thing," the guy said, tucking it aside. As he walked out, he felt lighter somehow, like he'd completed something important. He didn't need a response. He didn't need anything else to happen. He'd said what he needed to say, and now he could move forward. But moving forward looked different now. The past few weeks had changed him in ways he was still discovering. He started saying yes to things he would have said no to before. When his coworkers invited him for drinks after work, he went. When his friend suggested a weekend hiking trip, he agreed. When his neighbor asked if he wanted to join a community garden project, he signed up. None of these things were huge, but together they meant something. They meant he was choosing to participate in life again instead of just observing it. He also picked up painting again. Nothing serious, just watercolors in his apartment on Sunday mornings. But it felt good to create something with his hands, to make something that didn't have to be perfect or useful or part of his job. 6 weeks passed. He'd kept going to the coffee shop, but she'd moved to different hours. He rarely saw her anymore. He told himself that was fine. The coffee shop had been important, but it wasn't about the coffee shop. It was about what it represented, the moment he'd started waking up. Then one evening he got an email. The subject line was simple. "Thank you for the note." His heart jumped. He stared at the email for a full minute before opening it. The message was short. "I got your letter. I wasn't sure if I should respond, but I wanted you to know it came at exactly the right time. I've been going through something difficult, and your words reminded me that small moments matter. That the kindness we show people, even strangers, ripples out in ways we can't predict. Thank you for sharing what you did. It meant more than you know. If you ever want to actually talk, not at a coffee shop counter at 7 a.m., I'd like that. No pressure, though. Either way, I'm glad our paths crossed." She'd included her number. He read the email 3 times. Then he set his phone down and walked to his window, looking out at the city lights. He could respond. He could not respond. Both options felt simultaneously right and wrong, but he realized something important. It didn't matter what happened next with her specifically. What mattered was that he'd reached out. He'd been honest. He'd chosen connection over isolation, and that choice, more than anything else, was what had changed everything. After about an hour of thinking, he picked up his phone and typed a response. "I'd like that too. Coffee sometime? Somewhere that's not your workplace?" He hit send before he could overthink it. Whatever happened next, he was awake now, and he wasn't going back to sleep. They met on a Saturday afternoon at a different coffee shop across town. Neutral territory. No expectations. Just two people sitting down to talk like regular humans. He arrived 5 minutes early and felt nervous in a way he hadn't felt in years. But it was good nervousness. The kind that meant something mattered. The kind that meant he was actually present in his own life. When she walked in, she looked different out of her work uniform. More relaxed. She was wearing a paint-stained jacket and had her hair down. She waved when she saw him and he stood up awkwardly. Not sure if he should hug her or shake her hand or what. They settled on an awkward half-wave and both laughed at the weirdness of it. "This is strange, right?" she said, sitting down. "We've talked almost every morning for weeks, but this feels like meeting for the first time." "Yeah," he agreed. "I was just thinking that." They ordered drinks. She got something with way too much caramel and he got his usual black coffee. Then they sat and actually talked. Not the quick exchanges at a busy counter, but real conversation. She told him about her mom, about how she'd been sick for a year, and they'd known it was coming, but knowing didn't make it easier. About how she'd taken the coffee shop job because she needed something to do with her mornings, needed a reason to get out of bed, needed to be around people instead of alone with her grief. "Everyone kept telling me to take time off," she said, "to process, to feel my feelings. But honestly, the coffee shop saved me. Being present for other people, even in small ways, reminded me I was still alive. That life goes on and that's not a bad thing." He told her about his breakup, about becoming a ghost, about how her handing him that coffee had cracked something open inside him that he'd been keeping sealed shut. "I'd convinced myself I was fine," he said. "That being alone and disconnected was easier, safer, but I wasn't fine. I was just paused. Not living, just existing." She nodded like she understood completely. Grief does that too. Different kind of grief, but same result. You're moving through space, but you're not really there. They talked for 3 hours, about art and work and life and all the ways people try to protect themselves from pain, only to realize that protection comes at a cost. "I think we're both waking up," she said at one point, just at the same time in different ways. He'd expected this meeting to be about closure, about wrapping up this strange chapter and moving on, but instead it felt like a beginning, not a romantic beginning, at least not yet, maybe not ever, but the beginning of something real. Over the next few months, they became friends, actual friends. They met every couple of weeks, sometimes at coffee shops, sometimes at art galleries, sometimes just walking around the city talking about nothing and everything. She introduced him to her artist community, a group of creative people who met monthly to share their work and support each other. He hadn't been around other artists in years, and being in that space reminded him of who he used to be before he'd let work consume everything. He introduced her to his work friends, and she fit in easily, asking thoughtful questions about design and branding and making everyone laugh with her observations about corporate culture. What surprised him was how different this felt from his previous relationship. There was no pressure, no expectations, no sense that either of them needed to be anything other than who they were. They challenged each other. She pushed him to take creative risks, and he helped her think practically about turning her art into a sustainable career. But it never felt like criticism. It felt like growth. One evening, they were sitting in his apartment. He'd invited her over to see some of his recent paintings, when she said something that stuck with him. "You know what's weird? 6 months ago, we were both just trying to survive our own stuff. We were both shut down. And now look at us. We're actually living." She was right. Everything had changed. Not just because of their friendship, but because of what it represented. He'd made a choice to stop hiding, to risk connection, to be present even when being present was uncomfortable. And once he'd made that choice with her, it became easier to make it everywhere else. He started actually talking to his neighbors. The elderly woman on the third floor who always smiled at him in the hallway. He learned her name was Ruth, and she'd been a music teacher for 40 years. The young couple with the noisy dog. He learned they were newlyweds, still figuring out how to live together. And their dog was a rescue who was slowly learning to trust people. These weren't deep relationships, but they were real. They added texture to his life. They made his building feel like a community instead of just a place where people's apartments happened to be stacked on top of each other. At work, he started mentoring a younger designer who reminded him of himself, talented but scared to take creative risks. They'd have lunch once a week, and he'd share what he'd learned about balancing artistic vision with client demands. Watching this kid grow more confident made him feel purposeful in a way his regular work didn't. His friend, the one who'd called him out for being a ghost, noticed the change immediately. "I don't know what happened to you," he said one night over beers, "but you're different. You're actually here, really here." "I woke up," he said simply. "That's the only way I can explain it." One day, about 4 months after that first coffee meeting, he and his barista friend were walking through a park. It was fall again, and the leaves were turning the same colors they'd been when this whole thing started. "Can I tell you something?" she said. "That note you left, I almost threw it away without reading it. I thought it was going to be some guy hitting on me, and I wasn't in the space for that." "What made you read it?" "The barista, Danny. He said you seemed different from the usual creeps. Said you'd been coming in for years and were always respectful, so I figured I'd at least look at it, and I'm glad I did." "Me too. I think we needed each other," she said. "Not in a romantic way, just in a human way. We were both in dark places and somehow we helped each other find the light." He thought about disagreeing, about saying it wasn't that profound, but she was right. Sometimes people come into your life at exactly the right moment, and if you're paying attention, if you're brave enough to reach out, those connections can change everything. They sat on a bench and watched people pass by, joggers and dog walkers and parents with strollers. All these lives happening simultaneously. All these small moments that might mean nothing or might mean everything, depending on whether people chose to notice them. "I'm glad you touched my hand that day," he said. She laughed. "I'm glad you didn't think I was weird for remembering your coffee order." Neither of them knew what would happen next in their friendship or their lives. But that uncertainty didn't feel scary anymore. It felt like possibility, and that was the difference. 6 months ago, he'd seen life as something to protect himself from. Now he saw it as something to participate in. All because of a moment so small most people wouldn't have noticed it, but he had noticed, and he'd let it change him. 8 months after that first touch, he sat in a different coffee shop, the one where they'd had their first real conversation, and smiled at how much had changed. His paintings now hung in a small community gallery. Nothing fancy, but it felt amazing to have his work on walls instead of hidden in his apartment. The barista friend had helped him apply, had encouraged him when he'd been too scared to submit anything, had shown up at the opening and brought half her artist community with her. He'd started teaching a beginner's design class at a local community center on Tuesday evenings. Just a few students, mostly older people wanting to learn new skills or young people trying to figure out if design was for them. He wasn't a natural teacher, but watching people's faces when they finally understood a concept made him feel more useful than any corporate logo ever had. The barista friend had quit the coffee shop 3 months ago. She'd gotten into a gallery that actually paid its artists, and between that and some commission work she was making at work. They still met regularly, still talked about life and art and everything in between. Sometimes other people joined them, her artist friends, his work colleagues, that mentee who'd become a friend in his own right. And they'd have these wonderful, chaotic conversations where everyone talked over each other and laughed too loud. His ex-girlfriend had reached out a few months back. She'd heard through mutual friends that he seemed different and wanted to meet for coffee. They'd met and it had been surprisingly okay. Not awkward or painful, just two people who used to know each other catching up. "You seem lighter," she'd said. "More present." "I'm happy for you." "You were right," he told her. "What you said when you left." "I was living like a ghost." I needed to hear that even though it hurt. "What changed?" she'd asked. He'd thought about how to answer. "Someone touched my hand and I remembered I was alive. And then I decided to stay awake." She'd looked confused and he'd laughed. "Long story. But basically I stopped hiding." That conversation had given him closure he didn't know he needed. Not because he wanted her back, he didn't, but because it proved he'd actually changed. The person he was now could sit with discomfort, could have honest conversations, could exist in the world without armor. Now sitting in the coffee shop, he watched people come and go. He'd developed a habit of noticing them, really noticing them. The stressed businessman who always ordered a triple-shot espresso and looked like he needed a vacation. The college student who studied in the corner for hours, occasionally staring into space with that look people get when they're questioning all their life choices. The older couple who came in every Saturday held hands across the table and barely talked but seemed perfectly content. All these lives, all these stories. And the thing was, you never knew which moment might matter, which interaction might stick with someone, which small act of kindness or connection might be exactly what someone needed. A young woman approached the counter looking nervous. First time here, probably. She fumbled with her order, apologized for not knowing what she wanted, seemed like she was having a rough day. He did something he never would have done a year ago. When she sat down at the table next to his, the only empty one left, he looked over and said, "First time here? They make a really good cinnamon latte if you like that kind of thing." She looked startled, then smiled. "Thanks, I'll try that next time." Then after a pause, "Do you come here a lot?" "Not as much as I used to. But yeah, I like this place." They chatted for a few minutes. Nothing deep. Just two strangers being friendly. But as he walked out later, he thought about how he'd become the kind of person who initiated connection instead of avoiding it. How somewhere along the way, without really noticing, he'd changed completely. His phone buzzed. A text from the barista friend. "Gallery opening tonight. You coming?" He texted back. Wouldn't miss it. Another text came through, this one from his mentee. "Finished the project. Want to look at it before I present tomorrow? Come by my place at 6, he replied. His calendar, which had been empty for so long, was now full. Not overwhelming, but full of things that mattered. Coffee with friends. Community garden workdays. His Tuesday night class. Gallery openings. Neighborhood meetings. All these small commitments that added up to a life. That evening at the gallery opening, he stood looking at his barista friend's newest work. A series of paintings about grief and growth, dark colors transforming into light. "What do you think?" she asked, appearing at his elbow. "I think it's perfect," he said honestly. "I think it shows exactly what you've been through. We've both come a long way, haven't we?" She said, looking around at the crowded gallery, at all the people who'd shown up to support her. "Yeah, we really have." Someone called her name, a potential buyer with questions, and she squeezed his arm before walking away. That simple touch, casual and friendly, didn't send shockwaves through him anymore, because he wasn't starving for human connection anymore. He had it all around him, in abundance. On his way home that night, he passed the original coffee shop where it all started. Through the window he could see Danny working the evening shift. On impulse, he went inside. "Hey, stranger," Danny said when he saw him. "Haven't seen you in forever. Want your usual?" "Yeah, why not?" As Danny made his drink, they caught up. Danny was saving money to go back to school. The coffee shop was getting renovated next month. One of the regular customers had just had a baby. When Danny handed him the coffee, their fingers touched briefly. Danny didn't notice. It was just a normal interaction, meaningless, forgettable, but for him it was a full-circle moment. A year ago, a touch like that had woken him up. Now it was just what it was supposed to be, a normal human interaction, not loaded with meaning or desperation. Just two people existing in the same space, briefly connected, then moving on with their lives. He walked home through streets that felt different than they had a year ago. Or maybe they were the same streets and he was different. Same buildings, same streetlights, same sounds of the city. But he was seeing it all through new eyes. Back in his apartment, he stood by his window looking out at the city lights just like he had so many times before. But this time he didn't feel alone. He felt connected, to the barista friend, to his students, to his